Okay, I'm going to talk about some common beekeeping issues here. You ready? Here's my first piece of advice. I already read this to you once, but when you're feeling all freaked out about what's going on with your hives, the first thing you need to do is just calm down and don't do anything. Then you can go talk to some of your beekeeping mentors and maybe figure out what the right thing to do is. But now I'm going to talk about some of those things. Here's a typical freak out moment for the beekeeper. You go look in your hive, you can't find any brood, and you can't find any eggs, and so you figure you don't have a queen. Do you think that's a safe bet? Yeah, you might not have a queen, but that certainly doesn't prove you don't have a queen. I hear this statement real often in like October, and it always baffles me. Apparently somebody didn't tell them that the bees shut down brood rearing sometime in the fall, depending on your climate. And depending on the race of the bees, it could happen sooner or later or whatever. But almost all bees will shut down brood rearing sometime or another. And usually that's sometime in the fall, and then they'll start back up sometime after the winter solstice. So if it's like October and you see no brood and no eggs, then it's a good chance they just decided to shut down for the fall. Especially if it's November, that's a pretty safe bet. The other thing, if it's in the middle of summer and you're in a dearth and you've got Russians or you've got carniolans, sometimes they'll shut down in a dearth. They'll just stop rearing brood because there's nothing coming in, and they don't think it's a good plan to keep raising more mouths to feed when there's no food to feed them. So they're just hedging their bets, saying, well, maybe we'll bide our time and see what happens. On the other hand, if they're Italians, they'll just keep right on raising brood. That's what Italians do. They raise brood all the time. They'll sometimes raise them all winter if you live in a warm climate. But the more frugal races of bees, like the carniolans and the Russians, will tend to shut down. Then there's a real possibility that you lost your queen. You squished her between two end bars, you set the box down on her, you whatever. Beekeepers probably kill more queens than anything else. And you know, every time you squish a bee in there, keep in mind, I don't want you to obsess over it and lose sleep over it, but here's the reason why you want to try not to squish bees, because any one of those might be the queen. So it's a good idea to do things that avoid squishing bees, because sooner or later it probably will be the queen if you keep bees and you keep manipulating them. So yeah, you set down a box and you set it on a corner, you set it at an angle and kind of gently swing it around, you'll squish less bees, and that's always a good idea, to squish less bees. And when you put a frame in, or maybe you got some gaps between the frames and you just pry it over here and you squeeze them all together, it's a good idea when you're manipulating a hive to kind of keep them together so that you don't leave a gap where bees get in between them and then you pry them over together, because then you could squish bees between there. So it's a good idea to pay attention. But anyway, quite often you've lost a queen for whatever reason, and then they've raised a new queen, and that queen isn't laying yet, because if they start raising a new queen, by the time she's laying, it's probably about 25 days later, and by then all the brood, including all the drones, have all emerged from the last queen, and this queen just isn't laying yet. She will be in a day or two, but you panic because you don't see any eggs or any brood, and you assume that they're queenless. So you go buy a queen, and you try and introduce her, and of course they kill her because they already have a queen. And then you freak out and buy another queen and try and introduce her, and they kill her, and then you freak out and you buy another queen, and then you go to put her in, except now you pay a little more attention. You realize there's some eggs and some larvae in there, and you think, well, wait a minute, what happened? Where did that queen come from? She was probably there all along. So it's possible that they're not queenless. It's also possible they are queenless. The other thing is they could have swarmed, and there's a virgin queen in there, and she's not laying yet. And again, by the time she's laying, it may be that most of that brood will have emerged, and so there won't even be any capped brood, let alone any eggs or larvae. So what you don't want to do, of course, is just buy a bunch of queens and have them kill all of them. You think you can look through there and find a virgin queen, you're probably wrong. I find them mating nukes all the time, and sometimes I'll look through a mating nuke and I'm pretty sure there's one in there because I see all indications that there's one in there, and yet I can't find her. And sometimes when I do find her, she's hiding down in a corner not on any comb at all, hiding down in the corner. One time I found one that had run out the front door and was hanging from underneath the landing board on the mating nuke. Virgin queens are extremely fast and they like to hide. They don't act at all like a laying queen. And they're usually a lot smaller. They're not quite as small as a worker, but they're not as big as what you're used to seeing for a queen. And they don't move like you're used to seeing a laying queen move. A laying queen she sort of waltzes across the combs, you know. But a virgin, she just runs. She just runs like every other bee. In fact, she might even run faster than the worker. She doesn't look at all like a queen when she moves. So you're probably not going to find her. That's my point. You're probably not going to find her. So just because you don't find her doesn't mean she isn't there. So what do you do? Here's my recommendation. And I know there's people who say, well, you know, they're going to lose X number of days because you're letting them raise their own queen as opposed to buying a queen. But I'll tell you my experience. You buy a queen, she's probably going to fail anyway. So why would you want to spend money on a queen that's probably going to fail anyway? When you let them raise their own queen, they always accept their own queen. I've never seen them raise a queen and then reject her. So you've eliminated the issue of rejecting. You've eliminated that you got to buy her. You eliminated that you had to find her. You eliminated that I've had queens that I bought that didn't start laying for 2 weeks after they emerged. So I don't know if you're buying any time or not. But if you let them raise a queen, which you can do very easily, then you may resolve your problem. You give them a frame of eggs and brood, and if they have a queen, then you didn't hurt anything. They'll just, you know, they'll just raise the brood. You gave them a little bit of a boost during a time when they obviously didn't have any eggs or brood yet because they had a virgin queen. But meanwhile, now they have some eggs and brood, and that's good. On the other hand, if they're queenless, they can raise a queen and they can resolve the problem. So this brings me back to my primary rule of how to keep bees, is you figure out what their problem is and give them the resources to resolve it. In this case, I give them the resources, which are eggs and young larvae, so they could raise a new queen if they want to. If they don't need to, I didn't hurt anything, and if they do need to, they've got the resources to fix it. Does that make sense? You often hear people freak out and they say that they have nothing but drone brood. Well, sometimes they're exaggerating. They just see a lot of drone brood. 20% is not unusual during prime swarm season that they'll have 20% drone comb in there. Now, they probably won't have that in the summer. And a package probably won't have that. So probably the sequence goes something like this. You bought a package, you put it in, they didn't really raise hardly any drones, and you got them all the way through to winter, you got them through the next spring. The next spring, they're now an established colony. They have some resources to work with. They suddenly decide they want to raise about 20% drones in case they decide they want to swarm, and just because it's spring and that's what they do. And so they raise a whole bunch of drone comb, and you go in there and there's 20% drone comb, and that's not what you had last spring when you put a package in there, because a package hardly ever builds any. And in the summer, they hardly ever build a lot. It's always early in the spring they really want a lot of drones. And so now you're facing a whole lot, what seems like a lot of drones to you because you really haven't had an established package. It's really not unusual for them to have 20% drone comb in the middle of the prime swarm season. And it'll probably drop off after that. It's one of those things that's not constant. They want a bunch of drones during prime swarm season. They want some drones during the summer. They want less drones in the fall, and then they're going to kick them all out in the winter. So, in fact, they may kick them out in the middle of summer. If you have a really bad dearth, sometimes they'll kick all the drones out in the middle of July. And that shouldn't be too surprising. If you see that, it probably just means there's a dearth going on. And you don't really need to freak out. It's not necessarily a sign of something horrible, but it is a sign they're probably in a dearth. But if all you have is drone brood, then you have a problem. If there's no flat-capped worker brood anywhere in there, but you have a whole lot of drone brood, then you've got a problem. And the problem is probably due to one of two things. You've either got a drone laying queen or you got laying workers. Now, to tell you the truth, though, it's not very often I see whole combs full of drone brood with either one of these. But if I do, it's usually the drone laying queen. When you got laying workers, it's usually not a solid wall of drones. It's usually just one here and one there. They're scattered. There's gaps in between them. The reason there's gaps in between them is that the egg police are running around trying to remove all these eggs that these laying workers are laying, and they're not always keeping up. And then there are other bees that are sensing, oh, that's a drone larva in a worker cell, and they're trying to get it out. And so you may not have a solid wall of drones. You're more likely to have a scattered drone cell here and there. You can tell by that cap that looks like a Kix cereal, right? It's kind of domed. Used to be, you told everybody they look like bullets, but since A, nobody knows what a bullet looks like anymore, and B, bullets are often pointed now instead of rounded, maybe that isn't the best analogy, but a Kix cereal is pretty much exactly what it looks like in color, texture, and shape. So I'll stick with that. So you probably got one or the other. What causes drone-laying queens is usually a late mated queen. It's a queen that didn't get mated in time. If you take a queen with crumpled wings and she never flies out to mate, I've never seen her lay. I find them in mating nukes and they never lay. A queen that mates late will lay drones. If it's more than 21 days from when she emerged, by the time she mates, there's a good chance she's going to be a drone layer. And the more the time goes past that, the more likely she'll be a drone layer. So if she mates late, she tends to lay nothing but drones. And nobody knows exactly why. I don't know that anybody ever dissected one of them to try and determine the exact difference. Huber tried to, and he had Jareen helping him on that, but that was, we've got much better microscopes now than they had then. We probably could get further at it now, but anyway, something gets changed about their internal structure as it matures, but they haven't been mated, that they end up, when they do get mated, they're not fertile. They can't lay fertile eggs. You guys all understand haploid and diploid? Should I sidetrack on that for a moment? The sex determination in bees, for practical purposes, is that anytime you have an unfertilized egg, you end up with a drone, and you have a fertilized egg, you end up with a worker. I say for practical purposes because if the queen's inbred enough, the actual sex alleles are that if these sex alleles match, you end up with a drone, and if there's none there, it counts as a match. And if there is a sex allele there and they don't match, then it ends up being a worker. So what happens is, as long as the queen is mated with drones that are not closely related to her, these tend to always end up as workers. The reason that spotty brood is a sign of a poor queen is that if she mates with drones that are too closely related to her, then you end up with some diploid drones, which means that it is a fertilized egg, but it still develops into, it still would develop into a drone if it weren't that the workers always kill them. But if you take them away from the workers, they'll develop into a drone. But if you don't take them away, the workers always kill them, so you never get a diploid drone. Now, the other thing about diploid and haploid is I'm saying it's a fertilized egg or a not fertilized egg. If you think about it in terms of rabbits or people or most of the animals that we tend to deal with, you have a double set of genes. You have a set that came from each parent, and so you have this double set. And then in reproduction, when a new haploid egg or sperm is developed, then it's a random set of these genes. So, this one might have come from the mother, this one might have come from the father. It's just a random set. It basically splits it. It splits it all out, and then it randomly arranges them, and you end up with a random set of those two. So, you might have got your eye color from your father and your hair color from your mother, and so on and so forth. Well, in a diploid cell, then you get one of those from one random set from your mother, one random set from your father, and then that gets combined and makes a new one. In a haploid, you only get one set, and in this case, it comes from the queen. So that you get one set of genes from the queen, none from the drone she mated with, and that develops into a drone. Now, it's a random set from her, so not every drone is identical, but they're all only from her set of genes and not from the drone's genes. So that's haploid because it's only one set of genes instead of two sets of genes. So then when the drone makes sperm, every single one of them is identical because he only has one set of genes. There's no random set to choose from. There's no mother and a father to develop a random set from. There's only the one set he got from the queen. So they're all identical. Does that make sense? So there's your biology lesson on reproduction. So since she's only laying unfertilized eggs, they're all haploid, and so they all develop into drones. That's the bottom line. Now, usually you don't see a lot of multiple eggs under that situation. But the easiest solution for any of these really is if you give them a frame of eggs every week for about 3 weeks, they usually get it in their head that they want to raise a new queen. There's no guarantees though. You could probably tip the scale a little better. You could probably up your odds a little better if you can find that drone-laying queen and dispose of her. Now, if you're going to try and introduce a queen, if you're going to try and buy a queen and introduce a queen, you're going to have to find the old queen and dispose of her. Because odds are, if you try to introduce a queen, they're just going to kill the queen you try to introduce. On the other hand, if you keep giving them a frame of eggs and brood, probably in about 3 weeks they'll get it in their head to raise a new queen. They may or may not, though. Sometimes it depends on the pheromones that queen's making, I suppose. But generally, a queen that's not fertile doesn't make the right pheromones, and they tend to want to get rid of her. But usually that'll straighten it out if you can't find her. Probably I would look for her and try and get rid of her just to make sure this is going to work out well. But if you can't find her, if you keep giving them some brood and eggs, they'll probably resolve it. Laying workers is a little more complicated. I'm gonna make this distinction because it's important to the solution. It's not so important to the cause, but it is important to the solution. The cause of laying workers is a lack of brood pheromone. The open worker brood gives off a pheromone that suppresses the laying workers. It suppresses the workers from developing ovaries. When that open worker brood pheromone is missing, now I have to admit that some of this also has to do with the time of year. If it's the time of year where they would have shut down brood rearing anyway, then it doesn't seem to matter. They don't develop ovaries just because they shut down for the winter. But they do when it's a time when they would have been raising brood and there isn't any brood. That's what causes them to develop ovaries and to start laying, eggs. Their ovaries develop and they start laying eggs. The problem with, the reason that that's significant is that I can fix it by giving them brood pheromone because that's the cause. Does that make sense? Let's go back to what happens. Now, the workers start developing ovaries because of the lack of this brood pheromone. Then they start laying some eggs. Now, to get this in perspective, a queen-right hive probably has 70 laying workers in it right now. A perfectly good queen-right healthy hive. That's judging by some of the research that's been done when they just went in and they dissected all of the workers and looked for eggs in all of the workers to see if any of them were laying eggs. And in 100,000 bees, you've probably got 70 of them that are laying workers. So this concept that you have a laying worker and that's your problem is erroneous. What you've got is thousands of laying workers. That's your problem. And the reason you have thousands of laying workers is because you have no open brood pheromones to suppress them. And the reason you have no open brood pheromones to suppress them is because you don't have a queen. But we can fix it by giving them a frame of brood and eggs because we can give them those pheromones, which will suppress the laying workers, which will finally convince them they need a queen again. Does that make sense? Let's talk about the symptoms some more, though. This is almost a sequence of when you could barely make this out and to when it's obvious. When you first see a laying worker colony, it's not obvious yet because if this is just starting to develop, if they're just getting to the point where it's hitting the tipping point, they'll be raising some queen cells that have drone eggs in them, and they're never going to work because they still sense that they're queenless. And there are some laying workers laying eggs, and so they built some queen cells. The laying workers laid eggs in them, and they're trying to raise them into a queen, even though they know it's not going to fail. And they know it's not going to succeed because they know the difference between a drone egg and a worker egg, and you can tell because when they cap those queen cells, they'll put a dome cap on it, or when they cap a regular queen cell, they put a fairly flat cap on it. So it's obvious they know it's a drone, but they're desperate. They're trying to do something. Now, at this point in time, if you catch them at this point where you don't see a lot of multiple eggs yet, and you see like a drone cap here and a drone cap there and a couple of scattered larvae, but not much, not a lot of larvae, not a lot of duplicate eggs, but they're making queen cells, and especially if those queen cells have domed caps on them, you can probably introduce a queen. You can probably do almost anything that you would normally do to set a queen-right hive back on the right track, and it would probably fix it. You could give them some brood, and they'll probably immediately start some real queen cells on real larvae that they'll succeed with. You could probably introduce a laying queen from a cage. You could probably You can get by with almost anything you can get by with in any queenless hive because they still recognize that they're queenless. That's why they're building the queen cells, because they recognize they're queenless. What happens though is then you get more and more laying workers, and they keep making more and more pheromones that vaguely resemble a queen, and now that you have thousands of them, all total they're making enough pheromone that they're not sure they're queenless. They think maybe they're not. And then you try to introduce a queen, and they go, well, I think we have a queen. I don't think we need that queen, and they dispose of her. And so you have trouble introducing a queen to a laying worker colony because they have it in their head that they have a queen. Now, if you put a queen cell in there, she may just emerge. They may let that happen. They may just say, well, you know, yeah, I don't think this queen's doing that great anyway, so sure, we'll let this one go, and they'll let her replace him. But that's early on when you first start seeing just that spotty brood, and the few caps you have are drone caps, and especially if those drone caps are on worker cells, then that's a pretty good bet that you're in a laying worker situation that just hasn't progressed that far. Then, as it progresses, you'll start seeing these multiple eggs in the cells. Maybe at first it'll be 2 or 3, and then it'll be 10 or 12, and it starts looking like there's mold or something growing in there at first glance because there's so many eggs. Now you're at the point where they probably won't accept a queen. And then you'll start seeing multiple eggs even on the pollen. And you'll see eggs mostly on the sides of the worker cells because the workers can't reach the bottom of the cell. They have shorter abdomens and they can't get all the way to the bottom. Now you'll notice the laying workers, if you have laying workers, you'll notice they like the drone cells because they can reach the bottoms of them, and they'll just lay dozens and dozens of eggs in the drone cells and not as many in the workers at first until they just run out of room to lay. Now, keep in mind that sometimes a laying queen will lay some double eggs because she just ran out of room, maybe even a few triples, but it'd be rare to see much more than that. I wouldn't say it can't happen that she couldn't lay 4, but typically it's probably doubles and triples are the most I ever see from a laying queen. And usually it's because she runs out of room. Quite often, if they raised a new queen, and while they're raising the queen, they tend to backfill the brood nest a bit, and then after she emerges, they'll start clearing out a little space. So you'll see this little space with no nectar in it, and that's the space they're opening up for her to lay in. And then all of a sudden, she starts laying like crazy, and they don't open up a space, and then she'll lay some double eggs in there because she runs out of space to lay. And then eventually, they open it up more, and then those double eggs go away, and then everything goes back to normal. So just because you see a few double eggs in there, don't freak out and think you got laying workers. Look a little deeper and see what you find, because they might be. But I'd look for other things like whether the eggs are on the sides of the cells, are they right smack in the bottom. You know, laying workers for the most part don't lay their eggs right on the bottom of a worker cell. They'll lay them right on the bottom of the drone cell because they can back into them far enough to do that, but they can't get far enough back into a worker cell to do that. So I'm going to talk about a few solutions, but frankly, I only see 2 real viable ones. I'll mention the other, well, maybe 3 if you have queen cells around. The rest of them I think are more trouble than they're worth, but I'm mentioning them because people do them, and I can't say that they don't work. But the simplest thing if you're in an out-yard is you just take all the boxes that are this laying worker hive, move them someplace else, shake them all out on the ground, and then put all that equipment back on your other hives and go home. They'll all move in somewhere. Everybody's afraid there's this one laying worker and it's going to move into a hive and everything's going to go wrong, but it's not. It doesn't work that way. They all already have some laying workers. A couple of more laying workers move in. They still have a queen. They still have plenty of brood. It'll quickly suppress the laying workers and everything will work out fine. The reason they're so aggressive to a queen in their own hive is that it's their own hive. When they're lost and confused and begging to get in someplace else, they don't have the same attitude they do when you stick a queen in their hive. You stick a queen in their hive, it's like, who are you and what are you doing in my hive? When you shake them out on the ground, they go to another hive, it's like, I'm lost, could I come in? That's a whole different attitude. So just shake them all out and you're done. And that's probably the best thing to do if it's an out yard because it's too many trips to do anything else. That's my opinion. And then if you wanted the same number of hives there, go find the strongest hive and do a walk-away split on it and call it good. This is about the only other viable method, and it's real useful if it's in your backyard, and especially if you only have 2 or 3 hives and you want to go to the effort of trying to salvage this hive. If you put some open brood and eggs from another hive in here, which is another reason why you should always have more than one hive, in 3 weeks they'll probably start raising the queen. It sometimes takes 3 weeks of open brood if they're too far down that road. If they're at that point, like I said early, where they're still raising some queen cells that have drones in them and are never going to really succeed, and you put some in there, at that point in time, they'll probably do it the first time you put it in there. If you do it if they get past that, you may have to do it every week for 3 weeks before you set the laying workers back enough to get them to want to raise a queen. But 3 weeks is pretty much enough, no matter how far down that road they were. So that's what I'd do under those circumstances. Now, if you raise queens, this is probably your third viable solution. If you raise queens and you got a queen cell, you can stick a queen cell in there, and then they just treat it like a supersedure. Yeah, they think they have a queen, but yeah, they think they could probably use a better one, so they'll let that one emerge and they'll move on. I have done this in an out-yard, like when I set up a bunch of nukes and I put queen cells in them, and a couple of them end up queenless and laying worker because there's a lot of whatever around, dragonflies or swallows or something. And I take a couple of queenless ones and one that's queen right, but they're all weak, and I put at least 3 of them together to create a lot of confusion. I can probably just shake them all into the same hive and put them all in together and get them to do all right. With no guarantees, but I'm not risking a whole lot when it's just a bunch of nukes in my out yard anyway. The 2 of them are obviously going to fail at this point, and maybe I can set them right. That seems to work fairly well most of the time. So I already talked about that. It's really the open brood that's the cause. If you doubt that, you can go. Wisdom of the Hive is a great book. It's kind of out of print right now, and it's gotten outrageously expensive. But if you ever find one cheap, I'd buy it. It's a really good book. It's by Tom Seeley. But this is a quote from that basically says it's not the queen's pheromones that inhibit the worker's ovaries. It's the brood pheromones. And I already talked about that. So this is basically that time I told you they counted all they dissected 10,634 worker bees and got 7 of them that had an egg developing in them. And they don't count it unless it's at least half the size of a completed egg. So that's 7 out of 10,000 laying workers. So you always got some laying workers in your hive. If you've got a really booming hive, that's probably about 70. This is a myth that's been around a long time. I don't know how it's survived so long, considering it's obviously not true and it doesn't work. But the idea is based on the 2 theories. 1, that you only have 1 laying worker, and 2, that the laying worker doesn't know its way back to the hive. And I find that neither one of those is true. You shake them out and they all fly right back to the hive, including all the laying workers, and I've never seen it really make any difference other than you may be able to create enough confusion and chaos to maybe get things headed back in the right direction. Sometimes you can introduce a queen after this and they might accept her, but I don't consider it improving the odds enough to be worth doing it. But I've tried it many times, and then there's been some recent studies on the fact, and they pretty much all agree that all the laying workers just fly right back to the hive. This is a different issue. We're going to talk about robbing a little bit. Obviously, any of you who've experienced this, you understand this. Those of you who haven't experienced this, sometimes, especially when you've got a dearth, and a dearth is that there's no nectar out there available for them to go gather. If there's plenty of nectar to gather, then you hardly ever have robbing issues because bees are just happy to go get them from the flowers. They only start looking for hives to rob when there's no flowers to work. But if there's no flowers to work, they will tend to rob each other. And in my experience, the leading cause of robbing is feeding. I know it seems like if I'm going to feed them, the time to feed them is when there's no food for them out there. But if you feed them when there's no food for them out there, then you tend to set off robbing. And that's, I don't know if you've improved the situation. You think you're going to improve the situation, but You don't always. If you're going to feed and there's any chance that there's going to be a robbing situation or any kind of a dearth, then you probably want to try to prevent it by reducing all the entrances. If I'm going to feed, I got 2 rules. Number 1, I reduce all the entrances, and number 2, I feed all the hives. I don't care if they need it or not, because if I only feed the weak ones, then I just convince the strong ones to go rob them. So actually, if I get a choice, I'd rather feed the strong ones and then steal capped stores from them and give that to the weak ones so they don't starve, and I don't set off robbing in the weak ones. So if I keep feeding the strong ones and keep stealing capped honey out and giving it to the weak ones, I'm usually better off than if I feed the weak ones. So I'd rather feed the strong ones. But anyway, either that or feed all of them. Whatever you do, don't just feed the weak ones. That's just asking for trouble. I used to wonder about this until I started setting up a lot of nukes, and I'd be setting up a nuke that was queenless overnight, and I'd want to put a queen in the next day, but I noticed I'd set a queenless hive out there and they'd almost instantly start getting robbed in a dearth when there's a robbing situation going on. And it seemed to be they pick on all the queenless ones more than the not queenless ones. So I think they can sense that it's queenless, and I think that's probably something you want to keep in mind if you're setting up nukes and there's a dearth. You may not want to wait overnight before you introduce a queen in there. You may want to put that queen in there earlier because it may actually give them a better chance of succeeding at this whole thing than if you wait till the next day and they're getting robbed already. Because stopping robbing is a lot tougher than avoiding it, and if this will help you avoid it, I would probably try to avoid it. So if I set up a queenless nuke in the middle of that kind of a situation, I'm likely to just go ahead and I got a laying queen, I'm probably going to just put her in there when I set it up. I might wait an hour just so I know they've figured out they're queenless, because in about an hour, a very small amount of bees will probably know they're queenless. In 2 hours, a big hive pretty much knows they're queenless. So, and I want them to know they're queenless so they don't immediately attack the queen, but I don't want everybody else to notice they're queenless and start robbing them. So, this is often a problem. I get these responses all the time. They think they're being robbed, but then when you ask more questions, you start to realize it's just an orientation. On a nice, warm, sunny day, if they're raising new brood, there's going to be about 1 or 2 in the afternoon, this big bunch of bees that'll fly out. Could be earlier, could be later, depending on when the sun came out. But when they'll come out and they'll start hovering around the hive. If you've seen robbing and you've seen that and you have the contrast in your head, you can picture that these bees aren't really frantic. They're just sort of looking around, you know. They're doing this little, and they'll go around facing the hive from all different directions. One of the main differences you'll notice between the young bees that are orienting and the robbers is that the young bees are fuzzy. It makes them look a lot lighter colored to you. They're actually just fuzzy. They have hair on them, and the older bees don't have hair on them because it wears off of their back. They still have some hair on them, but the hair on the back of their thorax tends to wear off fairly early. So when they're real young, it's still fuzzy, and by the time they're foraging, it's not fuzzy anymore. So you see bees that are out there hovering around the hive, and they're all fuzzy. They're not robbers. They're just young bees. That's why they're fuzzy. Robbers not only older bees tend to be a little bit less fuzzy, but robbers tend to be even less fuzzy, partly because the defenders will grab their hair and pull their hair. And so they often end up absolutely bald. Sometimes you see these black, shiny robber bees, and that's because the guard bees have pulled all their hair out. In fact, if you've ever had a bee get a hold of your hair and just start doing this, that's a defensive behavior on the part of the bees, and the Russians seem to do that a lot more than the others. And then sometimes they accidentally get themselves tangled up, and then they start trying to sting you. But at first, they're not trying to sting you. They're just trying to pull your hair because that's their defensive behavior. Well, they'll do that to the robber bees. They'll pull their hair, and so you end up with these black, shiny bees. The other reason they get kind of black and shiny is they get in here in a frenzy, and they're just ripping comb apart, and so they're getting honey on them, and they're getting wax on them and whatever from their frenzy of ripping the comb apart and stealing all the honey. So if you look at the entrance, the other thing, of course, the giveaway is if they're fighting, it's pretty obvious that they're robbers. Sometimes, though, they're not fighting, they're not because they've already overwhelmed the guards, and so now they're just coming and going. So anyway, those are the kind of things you want to look at to try and decide. A real easy way to tell for sure if it's getting towards dark is you wait until after dark, staple some screen across the entire entrance so there's no way for them to get in at all, and then come back in the morning and see who shows up. Because if a whole bunch of bees show up trying to get in the morning, they're probably all robbers. If it's 1 or 2 bees, well, maybe a couple of them got caught out at night, but not very many bees get caught out at night. They're pretty careful to make sure they don't get caught out at night. So I won't say they never get caught out at night, but that doesn't happen real often. So if you've got 1,000 bees lined up at the entrance trying to get in, then you got robbers. Now, how do you stop them? I think the most important thing is to stop them as fast as you can. You don't want to sit around and think about this. You want to just stop them. Now, if that just means taking some screen wire and stapling it over the entrance so nobody can get in and out, at least the robbers can't do any more right now. And then you can start thinking about what you want to do next, because you can't leave them like that forever. Especially in the summer and it's hot, you can't just leave them confined because they can't haul any water to cool the hive. They can't, you can't leave them like that forever, but you can leave them like that long enough for the robbers to lose interest and go home. And then you can start deciding how you're going to prevent the robbers from starting up again. So if you screened them off and then just poked a hole big enough for 1 bee to get in and out later after the robbers give up, that's not a bad start. And then from there you can plan on what you want to do next. Another thing that's common is to take a sheet and dip it in water and put it over the top of it. Another thing that doesn't work half bad is a lawn sprinkler. You set a lawn sprinkler out there and the robbers think it's raining and they all go home. And that's not a bad method either. But one thing you want to do is do something immediately. The sooner the better. This is one of the few situations where you really need to do something now, because it just gets more and more out of hand as it goes on. Sometimes this turns into a frenzy that'll take over your whole bee yard. You'll have a robbing frenzy going on everywhere. It'll just get clear out of hand. So the sooner you get it under control, the better. Just closing them off with screen instead of a block of wood is an improvement, because the robbers tend to go by smell, and so they'll be wandering around trying to get through the screen instead of being smart enough to go over there and go through the hole. Where the ones that live there don't tend to go by smell, they remember where the entrance was, and they just go back in the entrance. So a lot of these methods come back to that, especially robber screens. Basically, the simplest robber screen is just staple that piece of cloth over there, wait for them to stop trying to get in, and then poke a hole in it. But I'll look at other robber screens in a minute here. I think the other advantage to the wet sheet is not only does it block their way in, but it also creates some evaporation. So if it's in the summer, which it often is, because that's quite often when you get a dearth, and the dearth is quite often what sets off your robbing, maybe the hive won't overheat in the meantime while you're getting the robbers to give up. And I think it confuses the robbers too, because all of a sudden all the landmarks they were going by to get to the hive are all messed up, because there's this big white sheet there instead of all the bushes and grass and boxes and whatever they thought were there. But it does seem to work. I'm not sure all the reasons, but I have not tried this one. This is one Jim Fisher highly recommends. He says you remove all the covers from all the hives, and it's true. If you remove a cover on any hive, let's say you're going to move a hive, you might want to keep this trait in mind. If I want to move this hive someplace else and I want all the field bees to stay there, if you take the lid off, pull a frame out, shake them back in to kind of disrupt them so they start nasonoving. They'll start nasonoving, and all the bees that come back will start piling up and staying there. The foragers won't go back out because they're not sure what just happened, but they figure it's time to get reorganized. So everybody will stay there, and if you wait about an hour, pretty much everybody's there. You can close it up and move it, and there won't be very many bees that aren't in the hive because you set off this nasonoving, and that nasonoving makes everybody think they should just stay home. So by opening all the hives, he's saying that that'll set off that Nasanov response, and they all try to stay home, and then that'll stop your frenzy. My fear is, though, that just sounds like a recipe for disaster. But it might not be a bad idea to pick the ones that are the strong hives and do that. Now, if you want to know which hives are doing the robbing, you just take some flour and you go to the entrance of the hive that's being robbed and sprinkle flour all over them, and then go to the entrances of your other hives and start looking to where all the white bees show up. Because that's the one that's doing the robbing. And it may be all of them, but at least you'll know then. And you might want to take their lids off, shake a few bees back in, get them nasonoving, because maybe they'll call everybody home. I like to reduce their entrances, because if I create a traffic jam at their entrance, they can't rob near as much as when they can really get a lot of bees moving. You know, they can do an amazing amount of damage in a short amount of time. you don't even have to build this robber screen out of Brushy Mountain now, because apparently they saw my website and they started putting a little hole on theirs with a little metal thing so you can change it from a screen door to a robber screen, which is cool. So anyway, basically you can buy this from Brushy Mountain now and you won't even have to modify it, but the one I bought I had to modify. So basically I added this block here, and what else did I add? How did this work? Oh, originally it just closed them off altogether, so I cut the notch here. So I cut the notch here and I added that block there. So basically they come out their entrance here because I blocked the rest of the entrance, and then they go across here and they go out there. That's how the bees that live there leave. The robbers all come up and just pile up on the screen and try to get in because they can smell the entrance right here and they don't want to give up on it. They just stay right there at the screen. They never bother to go up there and find their way in. I just put a wood screw in here and a wood screw in here, but you could tack it in with a nail. You could anything you wanted to do. Yeah, duct tape would work for a little while. It might not be permanent, but it'd work for a day or two. A lot of times you've resolved the problem in a day once the robbers give up, because once they give up, you'll still get one that'll check it out now and then because they're always testing, but most of them will leave after a day. So this was a robber screen I made. There's a U. Davis website that has a picture one that's just a board here, and the number 8 hardware cloth across this way that blocks the bottom down here, but it's all open on the top. And it still seems to work fine because, again, the robbers tend to pile up on the screen down here because they're going by smell and they don't ever think to come up here and go around the top. I know, it seems like they'd be smart enough to figure it out, but they're not. This is the other side of the same thing. This is the notch where the bees are coming out, and this is blocking the entrance right here. And that is the entrance now, and then they go over here and they go out there. So this is a little more complicated to build, but I probably would have a little more confidence in it too. But I've done this before. The first time I heard of it, I thought it sounded stupid, but then I thought, well, actually, if I think about it, it makes a little bit of sense. Again, the robbers are going by smell. So you cover the entrance with Vicks Vapor Rub, and all of a sudden the robbers are confused because all they smell is menthol and eucalyptus and kerosene and all those other wonderful things that are in Vicks Vapor Rub. Yeah, that actually is what's in it. But anyway, and cedar leaf oil, I think. But I think that's the entire ingredient set. But it does confuse them. Like the ones that live there don't go by smell. They just go in the entrance because they know that's where the entrance is. The ones that are robbers, they're going by smell. They come up there and they're trying to smell what it is they're looking for, and all they smell is Vicks Vapor Rub. So it seems to confuse them. Sometimes you just reach the point where there's no hope of really saving this colony, and you just need to probably combine it with another colony and call it good, especially if they've killed the queen, and quite often they seem to kill the queen. Okay, this is another one that seems to freak a lot of beekeepers out. They find queen cells. Okay, quick, there we go. Quick quiz. What do you think these are? They're queen cells. What kind of cells are they? Okay, I got one swarm, I got one emergency. Why do you think they're swarm? I'll purport that they can't be either, but then I'll tell you why. Okay, this one is capped. This one is open, but it's fully drawn. This one is open, but it's just barely drawn. This one is open, but it's probably somewhere between that one and that one. Maybe it's about the same as that one. This one's capped. This one's capped. So my first reason I would say they're swarm cells is they're all different ages. They're not all the same age. Emergency cells are all the same age. So they could be one of them's capped and one of them's about to be capped, but they're not going to be this small where it's not even drawn out yet. This one that is drawn out but it's not capped yet. This one that's not capped yet. This one that's capped. This one that's capped, and that one that's capped. You wouldn't see that with an emergency cell. They'd all be the same age. And you wouldn't see that with supersedure cells. They'd all be the same age. Swarm cells are not all the same age. Does that make sense? And the other reason he gave was right. There's a lot of them. That's another reason I would suspect them to be swarm cells. They don't tend to build emergency cells all just right next to each other like this. And there's probably another frame with this many cells on it sitting right next to this one that I didn't pull out yet when I took this picture. So there's a lot of cells, and that would lead me to believe it's also likely to be swarm cells. So anyway, so you open it up and you see a bunch of swarm cells, or you see a bunch of cells, queen cells, whether they're swarm cells or whatever. What do you do? Of course, I think the first thing to do is don't panic. This is a myth. I don't know where it came from. I don't know why somebody opens a hive and thinks, oh no, there's queen cells. This is horrible. Something horrible is about to happen. No, actually, probably something good is about to happen. They're probably about to replace a failing queen, or they're replacing a missing queen, or they're so successful that they've decided they want to swarm, in which case maybe I should help them start a new colony and still have it in my boxes instead of letting them go to the trees. But all in all, I don't see this at all as a bad thing. This is either a really successful hive, which I can leverage into a bunch of queens, or it's a situation where they need to replace the queen and I need to let them. But probably what I don't need to do is get rid of the queen. The only tricky part of this whole thing is to decide whether they're swarming or whether it's a supersedure or emergency. Pretty much, I just, if it's a swarm or it's not a swarm, that's really the issue. If it's not a swarm, then I should just let it run its course. If it's swarming, then I probably need to do a split, or they're probably going to end up in the trees. I know every once in a while you meet these people who say it's a great idea to just let them swarm, and I'm tempted to like that idea because I love swarms when I catch them. They're so energetic, they're so focused, there's obviously a natural thing that has happened here that they've just naturally sorted out to the right number and age of bees to start a new colony. And it's wonderful. That energy is wonderful. The problem is I'm never there when it happens. So, well, I'm seldom there when it happens. And when I'm not there when it happens, then they end up in the trees. And as much as I'd love to have them swarm and I catch it, I don't really want most of them to end up in the trees, so I end up splitting them. But if you're there every day, and if you had a nice baited limb that's low and easy to get to with some lemongrass oil and some QMP on it where they're likely to collect, maybe it's a great idea if every morning at 10 o'clock you can go out and walk through your bee yard and go, well, are they swarming yet? Go back out at about 2 and check it out. Then you might actually catch most of your swarms. But I'm not there at 10 and 2. I'm at work. So that doesn't work for me. So what I really want to do is decide what they're doing. If they're trying to swarm, I'm going to take advantage of that and probably get a bunch of queen cells out of it. But this is another one of those myths, is these awful feral drones that they might mate with. Well, I want those feral drones. That's the ones I want. That's another thing I don't understand about people who are breeding queens. They want to saturate the area with their drones. Well, that's a nice idea. I pretty much just let them raise drones. Reading Collison's work, I don't think I can make them raise any more or less drones no matter what I do. I might be able to shift the genetics of the drones I'm raising by giving the capped drone brood to the colony I don't care about their genetics, and giving more empty drone comb to the one I do like their genetics, and then maybe I could get more of those, but I don't really know that it's helping me any. I think genetic diversity is more useful to me than that, but those awful feral drones is the part I don't get, but that's the way they used to view it. The feral drones were evil and bad, and I like those feral drones. They're surviving. So what happens if you destroy the queen cells? Well, if they're about to swarm, odds are they'll probably swarm anyway. In fact, odds are if you find a capped queen cell, they probably swarmed yesterday. That's the odds are. And you think they didn't swarm because there's so many bees in here, but there's so many bees emerging so fast when they're really at prime swarm strength that you may not even notice that they swarmed. They may have to do a couple of after swarms before you really notice. And so odds are if you destroy a swarm cell, they probably already swarmed and they'll probably end up queenless. And if they didn't, they'll probably swarm anyway. And of course, if you destroy a supersedure cell, you leave them queenless and no way to resolve it. See, I have a lot of mating nukes that are 2-frame nukes, so that's a great way. Every time I see one that's about to swarm, I can take a frame that's got queen cells on it and a frame of honey and put it in one box and just keep doing that until I run out of frames that get to the last frame that has queen cells on it. I leave it with the original hive because I don't want them to end up queenless, and I don't know if the queen swarmed or not. And even if there's a queen in there, I might leave it just because I don't know for sure what their motivations are, and I don't want to risk that they end up queenless. But I can end up with a whole bunch of really good, well-fed queens that way usually. If it's foundationless, I might even be able to get more queen cells out of there by cutting each individual queen cell off of that frame and grabbing a frame of brood and a frame of honey from some other hive and set up another nuke, and I might actually get getting more queen cells. It kind of depends. If they're on plastic, it's not worth the trouble. Just if it's got 5 queen cells on it, I don't care. I just put it in the split because I can't really cut them off very easily. But why do bees mess up combs? I think there's a certain amount of genetics when bees mess up combs. Some of them just don't want to build where you want them to build, period. Some of them just like combs going every which way, crooked, weird things. Most bees, though, don't, because for years we've been selecting them to do well in our nice frame hives, so they tend to build straight combs that are parallel, and that's probably to our advantage. But there are things we can do to stack the deck to try and get them to build straight combs, and one of those is not give them the room to build an extra comb. If you put all your combs, all your frames tight in the middle, I don't know why the books don't talk about this. That's a mystery to me. They tell you to go buy your box, you buy your box, you buy your frames, you put them in there, and you go, well, there's too much space here. So like, what am I supposed to do with it? Do I put them all together? Do I put them all to the left? Do I put them all to the right? Do I space them all out evenly? Well, you want to put them all together tight in the middle. That's what you want. The reason you want them tight in the middle is actually they're 1 3/8 and they ought to be 1 1/4. So if you could put them another 1/8 of an inch tighter, that would be even better. But at least have them tight in the middle. I actually shave another 1/16 of an inch off of each end of each end bar, and I put 11 of them in a 10-frame box or 9 of them in an 8-frame box and put them a little bit closer, because if I space them the way they would space natural brood comb, then they tend to not try to build a comb in between 2 of those. You know, where if I've got foundation and it's spaced a little wide and they don't like the foundation, then they'll build a comb out here in the middle. I don't want to tempt them to do that. So the tighter that is up until it's about 1 1/4 inch, the less likely they are to do that. As far as spacing them wider in the supers, it works best to have drawn comb spaced wider in the supers because they've already started the comb. It's just a matter of making it fatter, and that almost always works well. It's a little trickier. If I have foundation, I'd probably put them all tight together in the middle because they won't build them quite as fat. But the next year, after I've uncapped these and extracted them, I can put them spaced wider, and they'll just build them fatter. And it just works better if they're already drawn. But so why do they mess it up? Well, another reason they mess up comb like plastic, they'll build the little fins off of it because it's not really what they wanted to build. And they can't really rework it because it's plastic, and so they build these little fins going this way, or they build a comb that comes out and goes parallel this way. And so a lot of the reason they're messing that up is they just don't like it. They don't, you know, everybody speculates on why they don't like Duragilt and what's the other one? Duracomb. And I didn't understand it either until I was reading Huber, but the bees, when they're building wax comb, they actually make the bottom of these cells so thin that once in a while the bee on this side who's working against the bee on this side will mess up, and they'll actually have a blowout, and they'll have to rebuild it, and they'll have to do it again because they're making it so paper thin, and that's what they want. They want all this paper thin stuff. Well, the Duracomb and the Duragilt is a sheet of smooth plastic that has wax put on both sides, and then it's run through a press and it's pressed. Well, they start working on both sides trying to make that bottom that thin, and they get all the way down to the plastic, and it didn't work out. So and that kind of plastic, for some reason, the plastic they put in that they really don't like. If you ever get Duracomb or Duragilt and they ever get a spot where they've chewed the wax off, they never rebuild it. They have no interest in rebuilding it. Where if you have plastic comb where it's actually molded in, you know, the cells are molded into it, they'll rebuild that later. But for some reason the plastic on the Duracomb and Duragilt, they won't rebuild it. So part of the reason they mess this up is because of things like the plastic in the middle that they don't like, or the cell size that they don't like, or just the simple fact that it's plastic and they can't rework it like they can wax. And all of those things contribute to them messing it up. Some people buy the plastic and then paint more wax on it, and that probably helps. Some people, you can buy the plastic with wax already kind of sprayed on it, but they spray a little tiny bit on it, but that's still enough to really tip the scale a lot, even if it isn't as interesting as more wax. Some people spray syrup on it. Some people spray syrup with essential oils on it. It does seem like once they've used plastic, they accept it fine. So I assume it's partly that they finally get it coated with some propolis or something that makes it an acceptable material to them. And all of these things tend to contribute to them actually using it and licking it and touching it and putting things on it, and then they start accepting it better. But sometimes no matter what you do, they mess it up. So what do you do when they mess up a comb? If it's significant in size, like, if it's a little tiny thing, I don't care. I'll just scrape it out of there and call it good. But if it's a whole comb and it's full of eggs or brood, I'm probably going to cut it loose and rubber band it into a frame. If you take any comb and put it in the middle of a frame and put some rubber bands around it this way so it can't fall out, you can get it going in the right direction again. And there's no point wasting it. If it's real small, I just throw it away. If it's got nectar in it, it's probably too heavy and too soft, especially if it's new comb and it's got nectar in it, it's probably too heavy and too soft and too messy. It's probably easier just to scrap it. But if it's got brood in it, I can probably salvage it. And it's the same when you go do a cutout. If you ever do a cutout in a house or whatever, and you're trying to cut all this comb out and put it in a colony, the first thing you need to realize is that when you get done, you're going to have less bees than when you started. And so they need less comb because they're not going to be able to cover it and take care of it. So you probably want to throw out all the drone brood because it's just not worth the trouble. Harvest all the honey because it's not worth the trouble. It's too sticky and too messy. You might do one of the frames of bee bread just to kind of give them some resources. If you got some really old black comb and it's capped with honey, and you might be able to cut one of those out and put it in there and get by with it, just to give them some resources. But for the most part, then you're looking for brood. And for the most part, you want worker brood, and you want to cut it to fit your frames, and you want to rubber band it so it stays in the frames, and then you put those in the colony. You keep shaking all the bees in where you're putting that, and eventually, hopefully, you have all the bees in the box. And if you get lucky and find the queen in the process and shake her into there, then they'll all move in pretty quickly. If not, you end up back at the place you're doing the cutout with a dustpan and a brush, and you brush them into the dustpan and keep dumping them in there. You eventually get most of the bees in there and hopefully the queen. But anyway, that's what you do with combs that are out of place. You may as well just get the hang of doing it. Because you're going to have to do it sooner or later. You're going to get a bad comb, you're going to have to do it. And cutouts are worth doing if you don't have to do too much work. People seem to freak out about this. They think they're trying to swarm because they're bearding on the outside of their hive. That's like saying you're about to get heat stroke because you're sweating. Yeah, you might be about to get heat stroke, but you might not be about to get heat stroke. Just because they're bearding on the outside of the hive doesn't mean they're going to swarm, but on the other hand, some of the things that contribute to swarming contribute to them hanging on the outside of the hive. That's true. If they're crowded, they're probably going to beard more on the outside of the hive. If they're hot, they're going to beard more on the outside of the hive, and certainly being crowded will contribute to them wanting to swarm. So indirectly, I'd have to say there's a loose connection between them bearding and them swarming, but that's not a direct connection. Just because they're bearding doesn't mean they're going to swarm. It just means it's a good, strong hive, and maybe it's warm outside. But you might want to look and see. If I see a hive bearding a lot, I'm probably going to open it up and see what's going on. Do I need to throw some more supers on? Do I need to make a little more room? Decide what it is I need to do. But then, in the end, if I expect them to swarm, I expect them to beard. I mean, if I've got a hive by mid-May that isn't bearding, it's probably not going to make me a honey crop. So I'm expecting them to beard. Nothing to freak out about. So yeah, I'm comparing this to you again. You know, if you're hot, you take some steps to try and improve the situation, and then you just accept it. I'd make sure that there's a little bit of ventilation, that they're not lacking in ventilation. I'm not so sure I'm convinced that I want to give them too much ventilation. I think that's a danger too. I think we want to be careful. I'm not so sure just because they all moved inside that I improved their situation. Maybe I actually made so much more work for them that they needed to go inside and deal with it. I don't know. Just because I gave them more ventilation doesn't mean it's better. If it's 104 outside, they have to cool the brood nest. They don't need the door wide open to cool the brood nest. They need controlled ventilation to evaporate water to control the brood nest. And I'm not sure that just because I made it necessary for everybody to move inside that I necessarily improved their situation. Does that make sense? I don't know. I'd love to do more experiments on just this concept of ventilation and use some temperature probes and kind of see what the temperatures are in the hive when you add more ventilation and when you take away ventilation. The only experiments I've seen on those lines are usually done in wintering. You know, they're seeing where all the heat is in the winter. But I'd kind of like to know what's happening in the summer when I add more ventilation. If I open up the bottom board and there's more, and it's a screen bottom board, or I prop up the top more, what happens when they all move back inside? What happened? Why did they move inside? Was it because it's now cool enough to go back inside, or was it because there's now a problem inside that they got to deal with, and now they got to control the ventilation and try and fix the problem I created? I don't know. But I'd like to know that. I think it'd be interesting, but I don't know that. I do know that bees have been ventilating hives with very small holes for a lot of years and doing quite well at it. So on these topics, I've got quite a few of these. I've either got a whole page on it or I've got it under my frequently asked questions page. Some of these you'll also find on fallacies. If you want to go look more information up on some of these on my website. And that's that one. Questions?
The question you were talking about bearding. Do you think there's you were talking about bearding. Do you think there's an advantage to the old slat? I don't know what it's called, but it's
a slatted rack.
Yeah, that rack at the bottom.
I think it's useful. Yeah, I don't know if it's worth. Back when I had 7 hives, I had one on all of them. And when I went to 200 hives, I just gave up on them and sold them to somebody else because I didn't have the money to buy 200 of them. And I think they're helpful in that they give some cluster space for some of those bees that just need to do whatever it is they're doing when they're bearding, probably.
So it falls into the it can't hurt category, probably.
Well, let's think about it a minute. And this is part of what I think it contributes. And I got to sit down. And part of why I think it's probably beneficial, I don't know if it's whether it's beneficial enough to be worth the effort is the question. But part of why I think it's beneficial is this. Let's talk about small hive beetles and talk about wax moths. And there's a whole lot of things where the density of the bees has a lot to do with a positive effect, like on wax moths or small hive beetles. So you kind of want to keep a hive that has pretty good density so that they cover the combs well, so that they guard them and they keep the wax moths out, and they guard them and they keep the small hive beetles out. But I'm walking this fine line that if I get too high a density, then they want to swarm. So this slatted rack gives me this little bit of a buffer where if I crowd them a little too much, they got somewhere to hang and they're not just forced outside because they ran out of space. There's somewhere for them to go. And so I think it gives me a little bit of a buffer where I can up the density with a little less risk of them swarming. But I'm not sure it's like overwhelmingly helpful, but I think it could help, yeah. And the guys who are the biggest fans of them were people doing comb honey, and they're always trying to crowd the bees to do comb honey. And so again, it gives them that little bit more leeway when they're trying to crowd the bees without forcing them into swarming. I think that's its benefit. Somebody back there.
Thanks. Good. When you said you could bait a limb for a swarm to go to it, you said you put on lemongrass oil and what else?
I said QMP.
Which is what?
QMP is queen mandibular pheromone. You can buy pseudoqueen, which is queen mandibular pheromone in these little tiny plastic tubes. You can actually cut one of those into quarters, and 1/4 of one of those is probably enough for a bait hive. And you can buy it from several of the places. I know Man Lake has it. I don't know who all else has it. That's where I've bought it in the past. And it keeps pretty well if you put it in the freezer, and you can use a piece of that on a limb to get them to be more likely to land on that limb instead of way up high. And you can use it in a bait hive where you actually put it in the hive and try and get them to just move into the hive. I've lured them out of trees when they're already clustered in the tree with a used box with some old brood comb, some QMP, and some lemongrass oil, and I actually get them to move right down into the box. Because it's kind of everything that a swarm keys in on is the smell of Nazanoff, which is what they're all doing. That's the let's get organized smell. We're all over here. And the QMP smell, which is the queen. So it's the queen and the we're all over here pheromone that they organize around. If you catch the queen and take her out of that swarm and take her a mile down the road, in about an hour they'll all be a mile down the road where she is. Because that's how keyed in they are on the smell of the queen. Well, that QMP is that smell of the queen, and now you put it in that box you want them to move into. It's pretty hard for them to resist. The scouts can't resist looking at it, and unless they've already made up their mind to go somewhere else, which sometimes I think they have, then I think it works pretty well to get them to move in. I've done it a lot of times and had it succeed. The only times I haven't seen it succeed is when they pretty much seem to have already made up their mind. They hit the tree, they all barely get landed, and then they all take off for the wild blue yonder. And obviously, they knew where they were going before they landed. They didn't spend any time making up their mind.
If you happen to use the box, if you want to bait the box, how high off the ground should that be? I mean, should it be way up high, or?
In theory, it ought to be fairly high. In reality, it'll probably work even on the ground because the smell does more to tip the scale than the height. But if I'm setting bait hives, I tend to take a little 6-foot step ladder, and I don't go any higher than I can reach from that because once it's full of bees, I got to get it back down. And I don't really want to fight with it 30 foot up a tree. So I tend to put them fairly low, but I will use a ladder and put them a little higher than just on the ground sometimes, especially if I can get like the crotch of a tree that's, just about 8 foot or so. I can get up on that 6-foot ladder and get it up there and tie it in that crotch of the tree. Usually I just use some old baling wire or baling twine and tie it to the tree and tie it to the limb so it won't blow around in the wind. And then when I come to get it, I can just cut the twine and take it down. Does that make sense?
Can I ask, may I ask one more? I have you're talking about why is the comb different? When I went to check my 2 hives, in between the 2 boxes, brood had connected the 2 boxes. So when I pulled the top box off, I had brood in between. Of course, it pulled open. What is that? Something I'm doing, or?
No, it's just you've got plastic frames, right?
Yes, I do.
Yeah, that's what they do. They're always going to do it. Nothing you can do will stop it.
Okay, so just scrape that off. That's gone.
I don't scrape it off. No, I just leave it there.
Even with the open larva kind of falling out?
I just put it back together. No.
Okay.
They'll clean it up.
Okay. Thank you.
I did mean to say this about QMP. If you take all your old queens, whenever you have an old queen that's failing and you want to retire her, drop her in a jar of alcohol, and eventually you'll get a jar full of QMP. You'll get a jar full of this dark old alcohol that has a lot of QMP in it. And if you dip a Q-tip in there, you'll have about the right amount to bait a bait hive or whatever with.
Just isopropyl alcohol?
Yeah, I just used isopropyl. You can use whatever kind of alcohol you want.
Just drop all dead queens in it.
Yeah, I just I keep adding queens, and I keep taking them out, and then adding some more alcohol if it gets too low, and it just gets darker and darker as time goes on, and it just works better and better. And it probably actually works better than the artificial stuff because you have more of a mixture of queen pheromones. You don't just have the QMP. They have tarsal pheromones they make. They have other kinds of pheromones they make, and all of those pheromones are getting dissolved in that alcohol. So it's probably a little more effective, but not everybody has a jar full of queens around. But no, I never squish them. I just drop them in. They die instantly. They hit the water and they go. They hit the alcohol and they just curl up. Yeah.
When you move your queen cells to the nukes, do you wait until they're capped before you move them, or do you move some open cells that are still floating in?
Well, it depends on the scenario. If I'm doing queen rearing and I know the age of the queen, then I move them exactly on day 14 when the egg was laid, or day 10 from when I grafted them, which is the same difference because it's they're going to start with a just hatched larva, and I'm going to start with a just hatched larva, and 10 days after that, if I made them queenless, then 10 days after that, it's the same age. So
they're capped at that point.
so they're 2 days from emerging. Yes,
Yes.
they're capped in 2 days from emerging. That's my goal. Now, if I'm walking into a situation like this, how old's that cell, and how old's that cell, and how old's that cell, and how old's that cell? I don't know. I'm just going to split them up and not worry about it because they're just whatever they are. So,
Thank you.
yeah.
Thank you. I've been told that if you put the open brood in a hive that doesn't have any brood, that you need to go back after a certain number of days and remove the initial queen cells that they form, because they will be made from older larvae that won't have been fed royal jelly the whole time. And then
Oh.
you go back, and then the next queen will be more superior.
And that's the theory is that you go back and see if they start with a 4-day-old larva, then in 4 days it's going to be capped. So if you went back in 4 days and destroyed all those are probably all actually the right age, but if you destroyed all the ones that were capped. But they would be the older ones, and any of them after that would probably be younger ones if they got capped the next day. So in theory, then you're ensuring that you have younger larvae that they started from, but I think the ones at 4 days are going to be the ones you want anyway. Now, if you went in there in 3 days and any of them were capped, then you could be assured that those larvae were too old. But I don't think they start with too old a larva. If they do start with too old a larva, I think they tear them down before they're done anyway. I think you're just trying to do their job for them, and I think they'll take care of it. There's several of the old beekeepers who started out with the idea that they would start with too old a larva, and after years of observation concluded that they were mistaken and that they don't. The beekeepers were mistaken, the bees were correct. Jay Smith basically says, it's been said by a lot of beekeepers who should know better, including me, that the bees will start with too old of a larva. But that's not true. So, no, I don't think they start with too old a larva, and I don't think you need to tear them down. No, I don't ever do that. But you could if you want to. But you don't want to tear all of them down. You just want to tear down the ones at 3. If there's any capped at 3 days, they are too old. They did start with too old of a larva. If there's any at 4 days, that's the right age larva. So I don't see any reason to tear them down. But I know people who would tear just those that are capped at 4 days down and then leave all the rest of them, with the theory that now they've stacked the deck to getting the younger larva. That's fine. It won't hurt anything to do that, but it's more work. And I don't think it's really going to buy you anything. And you don't want to tear all of them down or you won't have any, but yeah.
Do you have a recommendation for a source for small cell foundation?
I'm sorry, there's some noise here, I missed it.
Do you have a recommended source for small cell foundation?
If you want wax, there's none of it that's going to be clean. Dadant makes most of what everybody else is selling, so there's really only 2 sources for small cell foundation, and that's Walter T. Kelly and Dadant. And I have had people make assurances that Dadant is doing their best to make their small cell foundation from the cleanest wax they can get, but I don't know what that means exactly. And I've never heard anything one way or another from Kelly on the matter, but so that's about the only 2 sources I know of. I don't know of anybody who's actually starting with treatment-free wax, making foundation and offering it for sale right now. The only 2 people I know of who are making their own foundation from treatment-free wax is Kurt Webster and Dee Lusby, and I don't know anybody else really. There's a few hobbyists probably who are doing it, but I don't keep up. I think the simplest solution is let them build their own comb. If you don't mind plastic, there's Man Lake makes the PF 100 series and the 120 series, which is small cell plastic. It's 4.95, but it's not wax.